Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for coming. We're hoping that we'll get a few more people here. This is a very, very important discussion topic, and this breakout session is going to be looking at the energy transition. Now, I know we've talked about the energy transition several times throughout today and indeed yesterday, and it probably, I think, is the most important focus when we look at any discussion in the energy sector right now. But this one will specifically look at a report that the Atlantic Council has done, the Energy Transition Corporate Adaptation Strategies. So it's all very well us all talking about the energy transition. We really need to see, who is actually taking action, who's taking that action, who's succeeding, how fast is that action happening, and indeed hopefully we might be able to talk about and see some of the results, and perhaps we'll certainly have a discussion in terms of what still needs to be done, because as much as is happening within the energy transition, it is without a doubt that transition probably being the most important word here. And we're not really sure how far we are along in that transition. And when we look at transition from one form of fuel to the other, or any type of energy, I think going back centuries, I think we've been transitioning probably out of coal for a long time. And again, so it's not an instant transition, and it's not going to happen perhaps as quickly as some people might like, and a lot of players of course have a stake in this. So I'd like you first of all to welcome our panel here who's joined us. Todd Glass is with us. Todd is a partner with Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich and Rosati, so we're very welcome that you're here, and you will give us a focus on some of the legal aspects, the funding aspects, and who is doing business out there, and indeed what is available for companies that are moving in this direction. Because without a doubt, green is the way we're going, and I think it's wonderful that all of the key players have embraced that. David Koranyi has joined us from the Atlantic Council, of course, and he's the author of this report. You've all got a copy of it here, Navigating the Energy Transition. So this is a great report that he's put in place. He's a senior fellow from the Energy Diplomacy, the Global Energy Centre. So we're looking forward to hearing from you in a minute. Jerome Smith joins us now, and Jerome, of course, is from Total, but he is also the Executive Committee Chairman from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. And anybody who was at the panel area this morning got a little bit of a flavour in terms of some of the great work that's going on there. And I think the monumental task that you've all set yourself, the very ambitious task that all of the CEOs have set themselves by actually committing to this initiative. And we'll hear a little bit about how that can actually spearhead the workings of the energy transition and really make sure that people are more engaged and more involved. Because I think if it's coming from the top of the oil and gas industry, this is probably one of the most positive steps we've seen in terms of dealing with the energy transition. And we're delighted to, from Critical Resources, to have the founder and managing director with us, Daniel Litvin. So this is our key panel here. Between them all, they've got a lot of expertise, tremendous energy. They're going to share with us their insight into what is going on at the minute, what needs to be done. But first of all, I'd like David to actually bring us a little bit deeper into this report and give us a feel for what the highlights are and what we should all be really looking at. And then, of course, you have a copy of this report. You can take it and really look at it in detail. Is it available online too, where people can? Yes. So if you're happy sitting there, I'll give you the microphone, and please bring us up to date with the key elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining us immediately after lunch. We will try to keep you awake. As Edna said, my name is David Koranyi. I had the privilege in a previous capacity to be present and be active in the inception of this very forum that we are at, the Global Energy Forum. I used to be the director for the Energy Diplomacy program at the Atlantic Council, and in that capacity I had the privilege to run the agenda for this conference for the past 2 years together with Randy and Bina, so it's an extreme pleasure to be back here in Abu Dhabi, now in a senior fellow capacity. It was a real fun exercise to draft this report. As Edna pointed out, this is a rather short, not a comprehensive endeavor to survey what's out there at the moment. I didn't want to make any predictions, or this is not about, as yesterday's conversation led by Randy and Archie Johnston, this is not about peak oil demand when it comes, various different different scenarios. This is what's already happening and what are some of the responses that we are seeing in terms of IOC adaptation strategies. So the two questions that I was looking to answer in this paper, along the mindset of what Secretary Moniz was emphasizing yesterday in his keynote, namely that the incumbent industry players have to be part of the solution, and to what extent they are already part of the solution, to what extent they are playing a constructive role in the energy transition, and how are they coping, what are the answers or some of the answers that they are giving to the challenges of climate change, to the challenges of emerging energy technologies, what are these challenges to their core business models, and what are some of the responses so far. So again, a couple of caveats. As I said, this is not comprehensive. This looked only at IOCs, so NOCs are not in there. 7 IOCs, Exxon, Chevron, BP, Eni, Equinor. Could argue whether Equinor is an IOC or not, but for the purposes of this paper it is. Shell and Total, so again, not representative. I believe that there's going to be some conversation in the context of this panel about what some of the NOCs are doing and some of the smaller players. I think Daniel was going to talk about that. Or some of the smaller players in the oil and gas space are doing, which is highly relevant, of course, as well. It's based on publicly available data and corporate reports and presentations, and a few conversations via email and in person with officials, actually, of all the companies involved. So I had the privilege of getting responses and feedback from the companies involved. The first half of the paper, I'm not going to talk about that much. It talks about the drivers of the transition and how it's relevant for the IOCs. I think we have had plenty of discussions around those issues for the last day and a half, so it's not really worth recapping. The 2 points I wanted to highlight and underline, which I think are extremely important for the purposes of this conversation. One is the investor and stakeholder pressures that are on the rise, and this was a key issue that was highlighted in yesterday's geopolitics of peak oil demand conversation as well. Just a number that I included in the report that as of the publication of the report, the funds committed to divesting from fossil fuels amount to about $6 trillion US. This is more than 1,000 institutional investors, and this is a list that goes by the day, so this is a space to watch going forward. And the other piece of the puzzle, which is critical, is policies and regulations. And my personal take is that as the impacts of climate change become clearer and clearer going forward, the public pressures and political pressures for increased government regulation and intervention will rise, and hence the pressure on IOCs as well and their business model. So with that, what are some of the key findings, some of the commonalities that I found in these strategies, some key trends, but also some divergences that I wanted to highlight. So the headline conclusion, which is not going to be breaking news or not going to come as a surprise to, I believe, any of you, is that none of the IOCs investigated considers their threats to their core business model either existential or imminent. And hence the adaptation strategies that I looked at in the case of these 7 companies are very conservative and gradualist in many ways, again in the grand scheme of things. One of the key numbers that I included in the report, that even Shell, who I think is widely considered to be one of the most progressive in terms of certainly its communication, but also in terms of its investment strategy, invests less than 10% of its annual investment in non-oil and gas related activities. So and all the other companies invest less, in many of the cases considerably less. Another key takeaway from the report is that, and this was emphasized this morning, I believe, by Mr. Shihab Eldin from Kuwait on the panel, is the relatively low R&D investment from the energy sector, especially if you compare it to a couple of other sectors. That strikes me. In the last couple of years, though, there's an encouraging trend, an uptick in investment in a series of categories, battery technologies being one of them, is a critical piece. Total with Saft, Shell with Axiom, Sonnen, BP with StoreDot, Eni with Ocean Power Technologies, and a couple of others. It is now moving. Breakthrough Energy Technologies, yesterday Mr. Daskalsi from Eni emphasized it's a $50 million investment for now, but nevertheless it shows that there is interest in breakthrough energy technologies such as fusion on behalf of some of the IOCs. Again, low level, but it's an encouraging sign. And then finally, but very importantly, again, along the lines of the conversations this morning on decarbonization in the oil and gas sector, CCUS, and I believe Jerome will talk more in detail about what OGCI and some of the companies are doing in that space. And finally, again, scope is limited, so I only looked at the 7 IOCs. These are either US or Europe-based IOCs. So I haven't looked at outside of these 2 continents, but the imbalance to me was striking in terms of how further ahead of the curves the European-based IOCs are, and I think that reflects partially political realities and societal pressures, but investment strategies and divergences in those, and the assessment of market trends and trajectories is going forward. So investments into renewables and low carbon electricity generation is increasingly the norm in Europe. Total again is a great example. In many ways, you guys even have a target by 2035, if I'm not mistaken, of 20% share of low carbon in the overall corporate portfolio investment. Again, I mentioned battery technologies and e-mobility. European companies are ahead of the curve. Although lately we see some signs, Chevron investing in e-mobility and charging stations, Exxon actively considering investment, and this was one of the little pieces of the report that I did not expect to be picked up, but this was the one that was picked up by Axios and the Financial Times 2 days ago. And indeed, if this is going to be the case, then that represents a shift in Exxon's approach to e-mobility and electric vehicles as a whole. And then finally, I think what's also an imbalance in many ways, and in the case of the European companies, the branding and the communication and the way they project themselves to their customers and to their employees as well. And this is to some extent happening in the US as well, but in Europe it's quite striking. Equinor, I think, being one of the prime examples in terms of how they are rebranding themselves as an energy company as opposed to an oil and gas company, and making extra efforts to make it clear. Also from the perspective, and they emphasize this very particularly, the CEO says this openly, to retain their ability to attract talent in younger generations, because this is becoming a critical piece. Let me stop here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
And indeed, we will elaborate on some of the points that you put in there. But even though you say it's not a very comprehensive report, I think there's some tremendous information there. And for a short report, I think you put a lot of detail into it, and it is indeed quite comprehensive. Daniel, if I could bring you in here, and we look at your background, and you've been a big proponent of sustainability. You work with a lot of your clients on this, and this is now almost the buzzword for every company, for every IOC, for every NOC, in fact for every company that's not even in the oil and gas industry. I think everybody wants that sustainability, and even the International Energy Agency has that sustainability position now, and we had the lady speak on the panel too. This was not a position they even had a few years ago. So sustainability is certainly the big buzzword. It's something that it has to become more than a buzzword. And for many companies, it really is becoming a very true value. And they really are putting a lot of emphasis in it, and it's been led from the top. Talk to us a little bit about what all the companies you feel believe have to put in place to actually make sure that sustainability becomes more than just a buzzword that's thrown around in the corporate report.
Sure, thank you. It's a good question, goes to I think the heart of a lot of this. By the way, I think this is the report is a very...
Maybe you can come back a bit and talk a little about the report and then build on it, so please.
Sure. Well, it was just saying the report I think is a very good overview of what the IOCs are doing, and there's a lot going on, but I think it teases out the key things very well. As you say, sustainability is a corporate buzzword. It has been for some time. It's going up the agenda. There's a lot of company activity, as the report points out. There's a lot of excellent company activity. My overall take, based on working in this area for some time, based on all the work we're doing with a number of oil and gas companies that are looking to define their position on climate change, is that the leadership that the industry needs to take is not there yet. There's a lot of good isolated initiatives going on. The scale of the challenge, if you believe the science, as I think most right-thinking people do, is enormous. Fossil fuels are at the root, or a significant root of the problem. The industry in its rhetoric rightly says it wants to be part of the solution to the problem. The question is what it's doing quite there yet? I'll explain why I think it's not quite there yet. Just looking at the definition of the problem, I think a lot of the debate in the industry, and quite rightly, is around what does all this mean for demand for oil and gas. And it is quite true, I believe, that the predictions made by some NGOs and some investors that oil and gas demand will fall off a cliff are wrong. It's based on wishful thinking. Oil and gas demand will be there, it'll grow for some time. Peak oil demand, we don't know exactly when it will be, but it's some time off. Therefore, in that respect, oil and gas firms are quite right to continue largely focusing on oil and gas investment. Look at a broader question, however. What does oil and gas, what is the license to operate climate, or the reputational and regulatory climate around oil and gas investment? And I think that looks much more gloomy, much more imminently. The report the report quite rightly talks about a whole range of pressures that are in place. But I think that the key elements that I would highlight are the legal pressures, the lawsuits that are already out there in a large number. They may have a low probability of having success right now, but I'm sure there are lots and lots of many very smart lawyers eyeing enormous potential damages claims that will find somewhere around the world a court that will make a very substantial damages award. The legal and regulatory approvals process for new oil and gas development is tightening and becoming somewhat nightmarish for oil and gas firms in various parts of the world. New Zealand has recently banned offshore drilling. It's impossible, has been almost impossible to develop a shale project in the UK, for example. So I think the regulatory climate will tighten. Employee retention is going to become more and more difficult. A lot of the senior executives we talk to cite that as a key problem. Extreme weather events, whether or not one believes that they are, the extreme weather events, say over the last year, have been directly linked with climate change, in the mind of the public in many countries they are, and the oil and gas industry is the obvious target. All of which is to say that whether or not oil and gas demand peaks and when it peaks, the life is going to become, we think, significantly tougher for IOCs in particular, but for listed oil and gas companies, maybe to a lesser extent for NOCs.
We'll come back. There's a lot there, and there's plenty more that we can pull out from there. Jerome, I'm holding you to last, and there's a good reason on this. If I can, Todd, come in here because you're going to have to defend the whole industry in a minute. Never mind. So just give you time to get working.
I will ask some help.
Todd, you know, this is when we look at the transition, and I do think we look at all of the oil companies, they're all very much part of it, and they want to be part of it, and they want to be part of the solution as well. But look back in terms of, it all takes big money. It takes big money, it takes investment, and they have to be ready for that shift, but they have to commit to it. You have been funding a variety of different projects for many, many years. Sort of take us back in terms of, when have you seen a shift that's really moving, that you think is moving in the right direction, that some of the companies are getting this right?
Thank you, and thank you for the report and the opportunity to be here today. I would say that the transition has happened over the last 10 years, and let me dive a little bit.
I think that's very encouraging, because I would have thought it was less than 10 years. So
well, actually,
this
is sort of news from the front, and
right.
While I think that the oil and gas industry in particular is looking at these changes and they're still in the future, if you're in the electric power industry, it's happening now. It's very much now. And it's been over the last 10 years that we've started to see a variety of very significant changes occurring in the electric power industry in the US, in Europe, and truly beyond now. But I do think that David was quite right in identifying the 4 key drivers that are already taking hold in the electric power industry. There is a massive technological shift that's occurring. In the United States in particular, you're starting to see solar and wind at a price that is even less than natural gas power generation. Coal is, we've blown past coal, and Warren Buffett's utilities announced just within the last couple of months that 60% of the coal generation facilities in that utilities portfolio are out of the money. That's a big piece of news. And that's being driven by technological shift and a cost curve. Market fundamentals are also starting to change in a way that's really interesting. The U.S. is based upon, their markets are on a marginal cost basis, but yet solar and wind have no marginal cost. They have no fuel. So you're starting to see some very strange market dynamics as well. And while that isn't necessarily going to hit the oil and gas industry in the same way, you're starting to see this energy transition changing. You're also starting to see the customer preferences changing that Daniel was referring to. Forces on the electric power industry, which is part of the energy industry, saying we want you to be green, we want you to have a lesser carbon footprint. And one of the examples that we talked about before was in the space of 6 years, the entire data center industry in the United States has gone from whatever the utility serves up to 100% green. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, you name it, which happens to be the most significant load growth in the United States. They've all gone from various levels of green to 100% green in the portfolio. Just last year, over 7 gigawatts of separate contracts were let just to make that happen. So it's interesting. And finally, I would say that investment pressure, the ESG aspect of things, is starting to take hold in that industry. So from the front, news from the front is that it's definitely happening. And I would like to, part of the reason that I'm delighted to be part of the conversation is that I think it's time for the IOCs as well as the NOCs to participate, because I think there's great opportunity. And they're going to get a view of what's happening in the energy industry. It's going to create a real opportunity for them.
And I think probably David's follow-on to this is going to be the NOCs, because I think after this meeting too, and listening to Mr. Alfala this morning and looking at what's going on, particularly here in the UAE, and then I think what we're seeing in other countries, there's a case for a new report on this, and I think having done this, you've got to do its twin, so to speak, because I think you'll find a lot. But we'll maybe touch on that again. Jerome, when we're looking at the work that's going on with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, I think this is an incredible initiative that has been, as you say, as always said, this is a leadership initiative that has come together, and this is the CEOs of the key companies in the world, and they've actually stood back, looked at the situation, come together, put a commitment in there. Now, Daniel doesn't believe that leadership is doing enough, and perhaps isn't doing enough collectively. And yes, I understand it takes time, but I don't know if we have time in this debate. So how can they sort of speed up their reaction, their action, and what are they doing? Bring us up to date in terms of the work of the OGCI in actually making that newer sort of, more holistic energy environment something that is now that we're going to identify with the oil and gas companies as well.
First of all, it comes to recognize that the Paris Agreement is key and that we are supporting it, and that, as you said very rightly, we are not there yet. And we are not there yet collectively as a society, so in particular as an industry. So therefore we need to accelerate, and this is what our CEOs want to do, and they want to do it together, because together we are more than the sum of the parts. The first thing I think we do realize collectively is that we must think about what I said this morning, which is the concept of circular carbon, which means that the first part is helping our customers, wherever they are, to consume less, to have a lower footprint. Because if you ask any of our refiners among the IOCs or NOCs what is the best energy, they will tell you the best energy is the energy we don't consume, because the energy cost is an incredible cost for the refining operations of the oil and gas companies. So what we do for ourselves, which is improving energy efficiency, working on energy efficiency, working on lowering our footprint, we need to help our customers to do it. That's action number one. Action number
So there's
two.
a need for maybe a bigger education.
Absolutely.
And I think when we look at this region, particularly this region with every building, you know, with lights bouncing off at morning, noon and night, I think we're in danger, particularly even in Dubai sometimes, of light pollution. You know, when it's like every house is completely lit up. And, you know, when there comes from maybe a time of nothing 20, you know, 50 years ago to total abundance now, is it just human nature that people use,
Yeah.
you know, lights, and we probably have too many lights on here.
So it's a question of management and business posture, which is less is better, to some extent. The second one is exactly what we talked about, which is, and you talked about it, it is sustainability. And behind sustainability, there is the idea that just thinking about the fact that the best thing we can do is to limit a negative impact is not sufficient. We need to have, one way or another one, a net positive impact. And as we need to have a net positive impact or demonstrate that we are having a net positive impact, we need to think about this circular economy chain, this circular carbon chain, and therefore we need to think about our waste, and hence engaging, investing together through our investment fund or through the projects we are going to jointly develop or through the roadmap we are launching with governments all across the world in order to kickstart the CCUS industry, because we all believe that the CCUS industry is a must in order to solve the 2-degree C challenge. So we are going to launch, hopefully in 2019, a series of initiatives on CCUS in order to help that industry to kickstart. And we do recognize that representing 30% of the oil and gas productions across the world, if OGCI companies don't do it together, it is very unlikely that it will be done by someone else.
And indeed, we were just talking a little earlier, I think it was about 15 years ago when I was a reporter with CNBC, I covered the, you know, carbon capture storage. We were in the desert in Salah in Algeria, and I remember the trip very well, and this was going to save the world, and it was going to be wonderful, and they had invested so much money, and this was just another example, and they're probably still doing it. But again, you come back to the point where many of the companies have put the efforts and the investment in there individually to do it, but it's actually now time to collectively put the effort, and that's what will give us the answer.
Yes,
is that what you say?
Yes, exactly. And you know what? IEA has shown, has demonstrated that over the past years, it's neither technology nor availability of money that has prevented the CCUS industry to succeed and to take off. It is coordination of industry and governments together to make sure that both the will and the regulations were there. So this is what we are trying to do. And one more point I would like to say about your excellent report, really extremely well done report, which is, you're right. If you look at the share of other investments, over oil and gas investments, you may think it is very small. But here I would like to just to share two thoughts. The first one is, if you take the energy mix today, and you just take out coal, hydro, nuclear, and you look at what basically is expected from oil and gas companies. So the energy mix is more or less 65% oil and gas and 3 to 4% renewable today. So it means 95 to 5. So it's 95% oil and gas, 5% renewable. So it's difficult to blame companies for having done substantially more than 5% over the past years. What companies need to do is, or to think about is, are these companies the right companies to invest more or substantially in renewable, or do they want to concentrate on the 95% because they believe these are their competencies? And this is for each company, I would say, to decide, as long as they are all engaged on the 2-degree C roadmap, the 2-degree C journey, which they can achieve as well through the oil and gas business by focusing on gas, by focusing on CCUS, by focusing on energy efficiency, by reducing their footprint, by eliminating flaring, and so on and so forth, which all OGCI companies have committed to do.
Now, I do want to involve you, please, at any time. I'm going to come to you just in a minute. I know I'm saying come in, but I'm going to give David one thing to just reflect on here, and then I'm going to come to you right away. You know, when I heard you say that only companies even like Shell only had about 10% of investments, I mean, I was taken aback a little bit because, you know, particularly Shell, its message is huge. They're all over, you know, social media in terms of the great work they're doing, and I just would have thought it was more. You know, I was surprised when I read that too. Are you getting the feeling from the people that you talk to that they're going to increase this investment? And even as we say, when, you know, Exxon is now out there in the space, because they had made a decision many years ago that they weren't going there. They were going to be an oil company, and that's what they did, and they were going to stick to the knitting, so to speak. But I don't think it matters whether they've been dragged kicking or screaming to the table. It looks like they have arrived, and that commitment is there. But do you get the feeling that we're going to see, you know, more commitment? Because after all, these are the companies that have the knowledge, they have the expertise, you know, they know the environment. Okay, they might know underground better than they do above ground, but you know, that knowledge, you know, shouldn't be thrown away just because we want to move in a different direction. What's the impression you get?
I think there are some bad memories. I mean, remember the mid-2000s when BP was repositioning itself as beyond petroleum, investing in solar. Shell also went quite aggressively in some renewables. Chevron had some bad experiences in geothermal, so they tried at an earlier stage, and because the technology and the cost curves were not at a stage,
so they were probably ahead of you at one point, and
yes.
then they got burned, so to speak. So now they're afraid.
And then you could argue that they may be a little late in the game now.
No,
They are catching up fast, exactly. In terms of the competences, I mean, Equinor is quite an interesting example from that perspective, because they realized that the underlying technology for offshore wind is not that dramatically different when it comes to the underlying technology of offshore oil and gas platforms. So how do you leverage that kind of knowledge, technological know-how, construction know-how that you already have in place? And there's plenty of examples in the oil and gas industry that could be leveraged. We talked a lot in the last day and a half about supply chain management and the issue of various input metals in electric vehicles and battery technologies, and that's something that the IOCs and NOCs excel at, and that's what they have been doing for all these decades. So that's another big advantage that they have. Todd, to your point about what was happening in the electric sector, just one key point that I think Adnan Amir always emphasizes from my arena, and I think it's true, is that if you look at a company like E.ON, German company, utility, it lost about 50% of its value in the course of a couple of years. Yes, the Energiewende and the accelerated shutdown of the German nuclear reactors was part of that, but it was not the only part. The majority was that they completely missed the boat on the renewables sector. So that's right.
Let me take the microphone. I'm going to get around the room. Don't worry, I need a bit of afternoon exercise. It'll be good. Please give us your name and tell them to address your question.
So Orel Holmat Arya. 5-6 years ago, they were building a clean coal plant. I think it was in Mississippi, and they were using carbon capture storage as well. That was part of the goal. That plant went significantly over budget, was delayed, had some technical issues, and there's been such a big focus here on carbon capture storage. So, can you guys share with us what has been new in the last, call it, 3 to 5 years that kind of overcome some of the headaches or problems that plant had?
And since we're a caring, sharing economy here.
We have a GCI gentleman in the room who is really a specialist on CCUS. Please go ahead.
Sure. My name is Richard Jackson.
Good. No, and this is what we want this panel to involve.
Hi, my name is Richard Jackson. I work for Occidental Petroleum, so obviously U.S. based, but also very, I'd say, in touch with CCUS. You know, from a proud representative of OGCI. Yes, and we are, and I would echo the comments. We're very proud to be a part of it. We're very interested in finding the collective contribution, and hopefully for us, CCUS can be something to help. I would say a couple of things have changed over the last several years in CCUS. One, technology. Clearly, I think CO2 separation and some of the technology that enables really the cost component to help. So technology is improving, has improved. The other piece is regulation. In the U.S., there's been an extension of a tax credit for carbon capture that has been expanded. I think it's enabling investors to have more confidence in terms of investing in projects, and so I think that'll be a big piece of it. The other thing is, I think, is leveraging partnership for value chain opportunities. So Occidental, we invest and have had for multiple decades a business in carbon capture as it relates to enhanced oil recovery. And I think we are finding synergies today that we didn't appreciate really 2 years ago. I think that's another thing OGCI has really helped us understand, not only capturing the CO2, but the transport of the CO2. There's companies very good at that. You have enhanced oil recovery, and then ultimately you have product capability with CO2. And so I think as you put together a collective of companies, you put together a broader initiative around CCUS along with technology, all of those things enable more commercial products. But we do have to overcome some of these projects that have been unsuccessful in the past, and I think that's our job collectively, is to show how we're going to do that.
Any of our panel comments on please? Yeah.
If I might just add a little bit of news from the front of the U.S. as well. The other thing that I would say that has adversely affected the CCUS projects, including, say, the Texas Clean Energy Project that was going on for a while and didn't quite make it, and it had, I believe, 90% plus capture for enhanced oil field recovery, is that natural gas prices have plummeted in the U.S., and the shale gas infusion that's been talked about quite a bit is adversely affecting anything more expensive, whether it be coal, any type of coal, or anything. The other thing is now that you have very low renewable prices, that's also putting pressure. So the goal for CCUS is to find those other values that can be additive so that the electric power production can then compete in the market, because the market's not waiting for CCUS based generation projects. It's marching on, and so you're going to have to catch up.
So this, okay, we've got a few questions coming. I'm going to just, I don't know what from the camera, just give it to them from that side here. If you would, please, I'll come down to you with the microphone in a minute.
Yeah, my name is Kamal Benasser. So congratulations, Dave, on a very informative report. If you look at the energy transition, it's not only about decarbonization. It is about giving access to energy. It's also about improving the quality of the air, building a circular type economy in terms of energy use. So you mentioned that in the report in terms of SDG 7, and I would be interested to hear the comments from the participants. What are oil and gas companies doing on other aspects beyond decarbonization?
Okay, who wants to take that? We are sharing an economy here, so please on the microphone.
Yeah. No, I can. You mentioned two things on the top of, three things. Circular economy, I highlighted it, talking about the CCUS part, and I could even add to this that OGCI has as well created another work stream on nature-based solution and natural things, because we truly believe that when thinking about circular carbon and the neutralization part or the net positive impact part, not only we have to have CCUS at our agenda, but we have to have a systemic view, and therefore we have to integrate nature-based solution and natural things into the equation and try to understand which one will come first, where, how. And so nature-based solution is likely to be part of our collective and or individual, depending on the company's scope of work. That's point one. Point two, you talked about access to energy. And OGCI is not, as it is today, working on access to energy. But what I can tell you is most of the companies that are part of OGCI are one way or another one working actively on access to energy. In many instances, either based on natural gas, such as ENI in Africa, and they highlighted that yesterday, or such as Shell or others based on solar in Africa, in India, and elsewhere. So you are totally right to say that without working and incorporating as part of our business models the access to energy dimension, we will not succeed, or we will not bring the totality of the solutions that are needed. And the third one is air pollution that you highlighted, and obviously air pollution is as well part of the global equation, even if it is not directly by GCI, but it is indirectly through the fact that we are looking for a lower footprint economy in terms of carbon economy.
David, please. And in fact, gentlemen, if you want to come in on this one, by all means. David.
That's a great question. I can't agree more in another capacity of mine, although I'm not speaking in that capacity right now. I'm also an advisor to the SDG 7 team at the UN DESA, at the Secretariat, so it's near and dear to my heart, this very question. And I can't agree more than I would love to see the IOCs and the NOCs do more in this space. They're doing already a lot, especially in the access space. I'd love to see them do more in the clean cooking space, which is one of the SDG 7 indicator that is progressing the least. In fact, it's backsliding actually. All the other indicators are making at least progress. So I think there is plenty of room in the SDG 7 space and particularly in clean cooking and access to play a more important role.
And if I may say so to your point, dealing with clean cooking and access to energy is an incredibly cheap way to solve the climate equation. It is cheap, efficient, and short-term in terms of the type of project. It's not a long-term project. So we should really think about it substantially more.
Well, they don't want to get in this Todd. Go ahead.
This may or may not have been underlying your question, but certainly I suspect that there is a concern in certain countries that for whom climate change is not the top of the agenda, that the IOCs are maybe paying too much attention to it and neglecting other important issues today, like energy access. To my mind, what this highlights, and I'm not sure whether that was the motivation, but to my mind, what this highlights is the two things. One is it's really important, I think, for the IOCs and other oil and gas companies to be really holistic in their approach to these issues. It's not just climate change, there's other hugely important developmental issues as well that they need to tackle. But secondly, linked to that they and this is not a comment about Total or OGCI, I think there is some fantastic practice coming out of OGCI and leading IOCs like Total, but in general, I think the industry still has its head down too much in terms of working with governments and working with society as a whole to tackle the whole range of energy issues facing the world, of which energy access and climate and local air pollution are obviously key. There's still a sense of, let's just get on with business. We can still make money, oil and gas demand is still there, let the governments and others sort out the broader policy framework. I really think there's an opportunity and it's important for the industry as a whole to get much more stuck in with helping to proactively tackle some of these problems in conjunction with partners.
Todd, do you want to comment on this before we move? We have several questions.
Yeah,
and I want to
really quickly, all I would say is that it's not just a good thing and the right thing to do, it's an opportunity. Electrification is a massive opportunity, and when you start
a business opportunity,
an opportunity to make revenue and get good returns. We're seeing massive investments in technology. The digitalization of the energy industry is going to start in the West in particular, but it's going to create opportunities, and it's going to create the opportunity for growing the worldwide middle class even more so. To the extent that you can bring and electrify and bring those opportunities, it's a real opportunity to make money for the IOCs as well.
I need my microphone back. Thank you very much. We have, and I'm going to get to all of the questions here. We are going to finish in time because we have to get down to the blockchain, to the main hall, so bear with me on this. Sir, question to the panel.
Mahmoud Abunaga, University of Chicago. While developing the report, what kind of strategy do you think that the IOC were actually focusing on? For example, did they focus on using or directing their expertise and knowledge to develop sustainable technologies, or they followed the path of acquisition of already existing companies, smaller companies that were in the sustainability path? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and while you're all thinking about that one here, that one's for you, I guess, David, to kick it off, and then move it from there.
I think it's a combination of both. But you see this practice which I highlight in the report, and if you look at the table, you see all those examples of, I think most of the companies in this report establishing some sort of a venture capital arm that invests in startups and in companies and buying up technologies and investing quite heavily in that space. And that's actually prevalent on both sides of the Atlantic. I think Chevron has such an investment vehicle, but all the European-based IOCs have venture investment vehicles as well.
Even Mubadala, I mean, in San Francisco, the Bay Area.
Mubadala, I think so too.
I would jump on what you said earlier, which is if we want to succeed on climate change, it has to be a business opportunity. And companies have to be able to make money. Of course it is a question of sustainability, but businesses, I mean, you cannot do a business which is good for society if it is not profitable over the long term. And to some extent, a business that is only profitable and not good for society is not sustainable. So I would say these companies, for the bulk of them, they are investing because they believe long term it will make business sense. What we are trying to do as part of a GCI is develop long-term business opportunity. When we invest $1 billion as part of CI investment, it's not for sustainability, it's to put patient capital. We are ready to put patient capital to develop long-term options that will make business sense to solve climate change. So that's really the way we are looking at it, business.
David, I know you have a question. I know you don't need a microphone, so please.
Okay, I'll speak up then. I'm a little bit surprised to hear the notion, firstly, that companies have an obligation to invest in something other than trying to maximise the value for their shareholders. So often it's policymakers and regulators who stand in the way. If you think about the CCS projects in America, it was regulators refusing to allow the higher cost of that to go through to the rate base. Is it reasonable to expect the companies to spend money that they can't recover on proving the thing? If you think about the great opportunities for energy access in developing countries, there's nothing to stop other people other than the IOCs from investing in those opportunities if they're really such good opportunities. And if they're not really such good opportunities, then it requires the policymakers to allow them to become good opportunities. As you said, companies are in the business of making money. And so the tone of this conversation has been a little bit along the lines of the companies could be doing so much more to solve the problem, as if the government and policymakers bear no responsibility, where quite often the impediment to making social progress is governments refusing to make the regulatory environment profitable to create a sustainable business. And I would say a classic case is governments who say we're not going to allow fuel prices to be high enough for it to be worth developing the asset, and then shouting at the company for not developing the asset. So I'm just not sure that the conversation yet has been rooted in enough realism about it requires all of the actors, not just the ones that we think are rich and for the time being unpopular.
Please.
I cannot agree more. hence the fact that part of our job is to engage with governments in order to help governments to develop regulations. And I think what we have to understand is that we look for regulations. We are looking for regulations as companies. We need the regulations because we need the long-term visibility in order to develop our businesses into a pattern. The regulations are giving us the signal and the basis on which we can invest. 45Q in the US, as you said, Richard, is an extraordinary signal because it is an incredible enabler for the CCUS industry. By the way, it is an incredible way for the US to be a climate leader for those who are from the US here, because CCUS is the key stuff that is really missing in the climate equation, and there is one single country today that has put the right regulation in place to kickstart that industry, which is the US.
So what's holding it up? What's holding it up?
What's holding it up
in the US?
to develop that industry. It's going on.
What's holding it up is that the regulation only came in the last 12 months.
Yes, exactly.
And we've seen incredible progress in the last 12 months.
Exactly. It's going.
But again, we don't want to hear that because apparently that's President Trump, and it must be a bad thing that he's done because he's more enlightened predecessor.
This is the continuity of yesterday evening debate. It is off the record.
I know, David. Everybody wants to come in on that. Let David and please, both of you.
Let me push back on. I agree with the preset. I fully agree with David, but let's not be naive here. So this is politics. I make a very short. I think there is one paragraph in the report that talks about sort of the history of incumbent industries fighting back against change. And I'm not saying that this is what's happening here, but there are certainly elements of this happening. So part of the reason why there is no regulation or there is no carbon price in certain jurisdictions is that there has been, for decades, and this may not be the case anymore, but there has been lobbying efforts in part by some of the companies that we are talking about against these kind of regulations for years and years and decades. So yes, it's changing. I think the mindset is changing, the communication is changing. I think there's a realization that, as Jerome said, predictability and these regulations be in place are to be welcomed by these companies, but this has not always been the case. So again, carbon pricing, CCUS would benefit tremendously from some sort of a carbon signal in place, yet part of the reason why it is still not yet in place, it has been very actively lobbied against both in the European jurisdiction and after in the US jurisdiction. So again.
Todd, I know you want to comment. Daniel, do you have a minute?
Very quickly, I do agree that in the United States it's one question, and in other countries it's a whole other question, is creating the policy environment that creates the opportunity to get economic returns that will make it make sense for IOCs. Interestingly, the 45Q that is going to be so instrumental, one, it was not Trump, it's been sought after for over a decade that I know of. It just finally arrived, hooray. But what's interesting is that in the US, it's a tax credit. It is an incentive. It's not even a regulation. It's not a price on carbon. It is truly just money that comes out of a tax, it's a tax credit on federal returns. So, and it's the same type of tax credits, which use the same types of financial mechanisms, tax equity type infusions into project development and finance that we've been using for solar and wind for the last 15 years. So all of a sudden, here we are. So I think that there's great opportunities in that, and I think that the market will respond.
I just would like to rebound on this. One sentence. What you said is just incredible, and let's keep it in mind. Words matter, because in effect, this is a carbon price. This is just another way of calling it. And there is a carbon price in the US. Just keep that in mind. And when we help governments to set up the right regulations going forward, because we have to look forward and not at what has been done years ago by some companies, we have to think about what they are able to hear with their culture. And the US is about to hear incentives.
Right. Just to try and tackle directly your point, I both agree with it, but also find it reflective. I'm not saying this is in your mind, but when I hear that argument from the industry, I find it as a narrative a little bit concerning. I think it is spot on that obviously governments are at the heart of finding solutions, and there has been government failure on an extraordinary scale in many countries to come up with the right sort of regulation to solve this problem. So you're spot on that. At the same time, I think within companies and within the industry, there is a narrative that has become a little bit deep-rooted, which says, governments, it's up to governments, they've failed, why is everyone blaming us for it? Yes, of course it's unfair for companies to, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but it is part of the narrative that is out there, and I think it reduces the motivation and the incentive of companies to really get out there and engage proactively with governments to help them find solutions, which I think is what the industry should be doing.
I just want to clarify two quick points. One, I'm not from the industry, and the second is I didn't say it's one or the other. I said it's got to be both, and yet this whole discussion was sounding as if it only had to be the companies. That was the
I think that was the intent.
But there is something incredible to your point, which is sometimes when you see that a government is going against the climate equation. Few weeks or months after, the companies of that country stand and say, I will support the Paris Agreement, I will reduce my methane emissions, I will go to zero routine flaring, I will develop the CCUS industry, I will engage, I am for a carbon tax. And I am aware of at least 3 US companies who have done that very recently as part of a GCA.
Okay, we have a few more questions. And recently, I think it was at ADIPEC, it was Bob Dudley from BP who actually just expressed absolute frustration with the regulation in place, with also the short-term positioning and knowledge of many ministers coming in, and the fact that they're in for a few years and they're out and they're constantly playing catch-up. And you know, he said it very clearly. It's like they need help and they need education, and they all need, you know, to work together to actually bring this to be part more government and industry. Ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Litvin Mittal from Emirates Nature WWF, so I guess that's as green as it gets here in this room. But I'm really glad that this regulation conversation preceded what I was going to say, because I wanted to actually bring up the example of another industry, which is an allied industry here, which is the automobile industry. And we are talking about disruption in the automobile industry as well. We're talking about electrification. And yet, we are seeing the industry actually push back a lot on current regulation on conventional vehicles also. So, I'm not just referring to the Volkswagen-like scandals. I'm talking about active lobbying to push back against fuel economy standards in the US, for instance. So, like when we talk about the fact that sustainability is the new principle that needs to inform thinking within industry, the first step perhaps for industry is to embrace regulation that is just looking at their conventional business. And for the oil and gas industry, that would be around carbon-related regulations, or even with regard to conservation and what the activities of oil and gas industries are doing to nature and wildlife. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. And then the second part of sustainability is then looking at your core business and thinking about how this needs to transform to make sure that we are not harming the environment or contributing to carbon emissions. So that's a quick comment I wanted to make. And my question is actually around, do we think, and I want the oil and gas industry's perhaps perspective on this, that do we think that the transport sector is, from aviation to road transport, is going to be the last frontier for oil and gas, because that's where disruption has perhaps been slow to come, and we generally talk about renewables in terms of electricity generation. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get to this microphone. I think we're seeing great speed on the personal vehicles, but how it moves beyond that. Shall I give it to you first? Okay. Here we go.
So, if I look at the oil industry, not the gas industry, it's basically transport and petchem. I would say that the last frontier for the oil industry will be petchem, because we will need petchem behind, and petchem to some extent, when they are done well, are incredible carbon sinks. They are. That's the first part. And then when you look at transportation, I think we are very concerned and very engaged, and we want to be engaged on reducing emissions as part of the transportation sector. And as part of OGCI, we have created one workstream dedicated to working with ONMs and others on transportation and reducing emissions of transportation. It is led by Saudi Aramco, who is doing an incredible job on this. And when you look at transportation, you have basically marine, aviation, heavy duty, light duty, to make it simple. It is clear, I think, for everybody that light duty will, I would say, be maybe as fast as possible, but will be the fastest electrified. And the problems will not be in the light duty long term. The problem will be in the heavy duty, maybe in the marine industry, maybe less, because the marine industry may shift to LNG or may shift to electricity too, but will be in heavy duty and aviation. So if you're asking me where I believe the last frontier will be in transportation, they will be there.
Anyone else a comment on this?
Just a quick also response. I think that despite some of the pushback on the CAFE standards and things of that nature that are currently in the regulatory rollback that's in fashion in the US at the moment, I do think that what you're seeing in both European and US automakers are driven by the Teslas and the other types of innovation in the industry over the last 5 to 10 years. I think that they are moving forward towards that. So notwithstanding the CAFE standards that would be a policy driver, I think it's consumer and other types of more intelligent ways of using transportation that are coming. It is coming, but just not perhaps due to the same factors.
Okay, we one last question here because there is a session on blockchain, and I'm under duty to get you all back downstairs at 3:15. So your question to the panel, and maybe make it one they can all think and inspire with us as well. Thanks.
Well, maybe then I'm not the right person to ask that question, because my name is Andre Eliv. I work for IDEA here. I was just a bit puzzled by the discussion, because we started acknowledging that the oil demand is not going to disappear overnight. So probably for decades there is a need for oil and gas production. And we're talking about companies whose core business is extracting oil and gas and refining it. And then all of a sudden we switched to this whole mode of, why don't these companies do A, B, C, D, E, things that are not necessarily good at. They're not necessarily, well, I mean, oil companies have competitive advantage in producing oil. The reason why a lot of the BP and the rest of the actually exited a lot of these businesses, because these are value destructive and they're not very good at it, and the kind of return profile doesn't really meet expectations of investors. As an investor, you have a choice whether to allocate capital to a company that produces oil, or a company that provides access to electricity to the poor households, or a company that invests in venture-type R&D. And I would argue that the companies would be better served doing what they do best. Of course, following the environmental regulations and all like that, but not necessarily invest in all these other things that are not necessarily their core, just because they happen to be in the energy business.
Super. And I think keep this in mind with your wrapping up comments, because we're all going to have to go. And somebody, I think, put that very issue to Patrick Pouyanné recently at a conference. And again, it's like, wow, you used to be an oil and gas company, and suddenly now you've embraced renewables and you've decided to become an energy company. To which he actually said, we've always been an energy company. And all of us in this space, need to look at our consumers, look at what our consumers are demanding. If your customers, yes, want oil and gas, which they will do, but they're also looking for something cleaner and greener, you kind of can't ignore them. But anyway, never mind. Let's see what everybody else here has to say, and with this will be your final comments, and then we'll all head downstairs. So I'm going to give it to you at the minute, Todd.
Oh, I'm first up. Lucky me. I would say this, that I do think that there's economic opportunity for these companies on an international basis. I think that it was mentioned that the IOCs have some of the most patient capital, and they're used to investing for the long run. And if you take a long run and you look out 20, 30 years, and you see a future that creates opportunity. Is the opportunity, as was discussed, I think the Saudi minister this morning made it very clear. If you look at long run, it's not, the best way to do things is not just to burn your fuel for power or for transport. Rather, there's higher and better uses of your oil. And he said the most exciting thing that was going on was renewables. So if you think out 30 years, and you have that investment planning horizon, and you have the patience, you would start to look at some of these more, the electrified parts of the future, and see investments from venture, and most of the IOCs do invest on a venture basis. Take a look at the other part of the energy industry, other than just digitalization of oil and gas. Digitalization of the electric grid also provides opportunities. I think that the oil and gas industry is actually very well situated to do what banks, as Mike Eckert said, he can't do because of Basel, to do things on an international basis that nobody else can. So I would be perfectly happy. I mean, somebody said earlier that only 10%, if all of the IOCs did 10% investment in that, I would be perfectly fine.
Okay, David, hold it for the end, if I can just get a comment from Daniel and from Jerome, please.
If I understood it, the question was, why on earth should?
Why bother?
Stick
with your knitting. Do oil and gas. This is what you've done well for years. So, and again, a very valid point, I think, in maybe a different industry, where you don't have a huge outcry of politics and consumers and all of that. But please, from you.
So I totally agree. Actually, I think there's a lot of naivety in the demands often made of oil and gas companies to shut down or wind down your business, go and do wind farms. So that's not their core skill. Some of them, it isn't large companies like Total may be able to do it very effectively, but it's a naive demand that doesn't play to the idea of core competence. Now, does that mean that there are more things that an oil and gas company can be doing in terms of thinking about the future, engaging with governments, understanding and working on issues of energy efficiency, energy access? Absolutely not. I think that that the naivety of some of the demands made of oil and gas companies sometimes allows the industry to dismiss the pressures a little bit too easily and not to recognise the broader picture, which is, if you believe the science, an existential crisis for the world, and this is an industry that many are holding largely responsible for it. What else do we need to do? And I think OGCI and other initiatives of that sort are excellent. I would just like to see a sort of a doubling or a trebling or a quadrupling of that sort of work.
Okay, Jerome and Davis, you've got 30 seconds each, because we've got to get moving.
So, very simply, first of all, I remind you there is no silver bullet to the climate change equation, and it's complex. Therefore, there are many things we can do, either within our existing core businesses or outside our existing core businesses. Some decide to focus on the existing one for the very reason you highlighted. Some decide to create other businesses or to launch other businesses because they believe they can add to it. And it doesn't mean that some are better than the others, for the very reasons you highlighted in particular. And the only thing we are convinced about collectively is that it's so complex that we are better working together on that, because we need to go faster and faster because there is urgency. And the second thing we are convinced about is that it has to be a business. It has to be a business opportunity. It has to be profitable, because the only way to engage the trillions, the tens and hundreds of trillions of dollars that we need to solve the climate equation is for these hundreds of trillions of dollars to be business-minded, because there is no philanthropy for hundreds of trillions of dollars. It is as simple as that. And we are focusing on creating this business model and working with governments to create the enablers, the policy that will enable that. Thank you.
So, David, you might have some new focus for the new report, but from this session, please, your closing words.
So I agree with everything said before, although I would dispute the premise of your point. So my point would be, closing point, we live in an incredibly fast-changing world. And this was in The Economist, I think, 2 years ago, and by no means applicable to this very situation, so don't hold me against it. But the article was about a major international environmental conference in 1917. The conference was about horse manure piling up on the streets of New York and London and all the major cities, because the urban transportation at the time was almost exclusively by horse-drawn carriages and tramways. And it was hundreds of thousands of tons of horse manure piling up on the streets. The smell, the whole impact on the city's life. So this was a major issue even during the First World War. By 1922, the last horse-drawn carriage was retired in all major cities of the world. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying that this is the 21st century. We are living in an even more fast-changing universe. So if I was an IOC, I would not want to be exclusively in the horse-drawn carriage construction business.
You see, so it was the perfect last question. Thank you so much. We have to wrap it up there because we've got to get back down to the big hall. So a huge thanks to Daniel, to Jerome, to David, and to Todd. Thank you all so much.